know, do you guys see that it's recording? Or am I the only one that can see that?
I see that it's recording.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. Okay, good. I think this is right then. Awesome. Well, yeah, again, thanks so much, John. As you know, I'm Anna Lee. John and I met through the Bigger Center winter service trips. And then you both can introduce yourselves as well, Marissa and Kevin.
I'm Kevin Thompson. I'm a 2L at the University of Minnesota. I'm in the detainee rights clinic with Marissa. Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Marissa Tillman. I'm a dual degree student, so I'm going into my 4th year at the law school and at Humphrey. And yeah, I was in the detainee rights clinic, and immigration law is really kind of the direction I want my career to go. So.
Great. So yeah, John, if you want to start out by just telling us what it is that you do, maybe a little bit about your background, how you got interested in immigration, and of course, like where you went to school and JLI, things like that.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm currently a staff attorney in the Refugee and Immigrant Program at the Advocates for Human Rights here in Minneapolis. I've been in that role coming up on 2 months. So it was, so I'm kind of new there and started during this whole kind of crazy times. I was in private practice at a small immigration firm here in the Twin Cities for I guess about 2 years. Before that, I went to the U of M Law School. I graduated in 2017. I was a staffer on JLI and worked in the immigration clinics. So I was a student attorney in the Federal Immigration Litigation Clinic, and then I guess a student director in the Detainee Rights Clinic my 3L year.
Awesome. So just to get started, we were hoping maybe you could explain and give some background about what MPP is for people that might not be familiar.
Sure. So MPP is the Migrant Protection Protocols. It was implemented, I guess about a year ago this summer at the southern border of the United States. It kind of phased in at several ports of entry. And basically it was created kind of through executive action at the federal level, through Department of Homeland Security. Basically, it dramatically changes how asylum seekers arriving at the southern border of the United States are able to request asylum. So in the past, over the past, several decades, people that were fleeing their home countries, particularly in Mexico and Central America, would come up to the southern border of the U.S., Mexico-U.S. border, go to a port of entry, basically where cars, cross the border, where trucks cross the border, where people can walk across, where there's kind of border towns on each side. And, at the kind of the line for admission, they say to the Border Patrol officer, "I'm afraid to go back to my country. I'm requesting asylum." So what would happen at that point is that person would be kind of deferred over to kind of moved out of the line. And then they would typically be detained by Border Patrol to assess their asylum claim. So they're given what's called a credible fear interview, basically asking them questions to see if there's a good likelihood that they would be able to prevail on an asylum claim. Kind of the mechanics of that have changed a little bit over time. What we've seen kind of most recently is that people are taken into custody and put in detention for maybe a couple of weeks, given their interview. If they pass, then they're released in the United States. More recently, they've just been detained for the entirety of the proceedings. If they fail the interview, then they're able to go in front of an immigration judge and request review of the CFI determination. If they fail that, or it doesn't get reversed, then they're deported pretty quickly. Under the Obama administration, a lot of people that were coming to the border and requesting asylum were just let into the U.S., sent on their way to live with family if they had family in the U.S., and then given a date to show up in immigration court. So just going directly to the immigration judge. What's happened with MPP is basically that that people are stopped at the border, and instead of being let in to apply for asylum inside, are being told to go back into Mexico and wait for a court date. So Annalie and I went to Brownsville, which is one of the border towns in Texas. It's across the border from Matamoros. And so people there that are presenting are then sent back to Matamoros to wait for their court hearing. When they have a hearing, then they basically get in line to walk across the border, and then they're let in, kind of escorted into a court, a very makeshift court that's set up inside the port of entry, where they appear in front of an immigration judge by video. And that's more or less what's happening, or was happening across the border, or all along the border. Some places like San Diego, they were being brought into an immigration court that's right there, but there is no standalone or normal immigration court that's in a lot of these cities. Obviously, there's a lot of concerns with forcing people to live in Matamoros, and sometimes they're waiting like a year or two for their final hearing, and they're oftentimes homeless and incredibly vulnerable to kidnapping and extortion and sexual violence and different medical issues. Basically, a lot of them are living in kind of makeshift homeless camps right outside the port. And that's been kind of what we've been seeing for the past about 10 months or so in a lot of these places. That's changed pretty dramatically with the outbreak of COVID-19. Pretty recently, President Trump issued an order suspending any sort of presentation like that at the border. So Border Patrol is given pretty extraordinary power. If someone crossed the border without authorization or presented at a port of entry, instead of now being sent back into Mexico to wait, now they're just being summarily deported. So that's kind of cut off the flow of new MPP cases. The MPP program still continues for people that have been subjected to that previously. They're kind of grandfathered in. But the MPP program itself is also being put on hold due to the pandemic, basically because, or basically all these cases are being postponed. So people that have had hearing dates during this time still have to go to, or had to go to the port of entry to request a new hearing date, and to get necessary documents to be able to maintain some legal status in Mexico and permission to wait there. But with MPP, non-detained immigration court has also been postponed kind of indefinitely. All those hearings have been canceled. MPP is in a little bit of a weird place between detained and non-detained court. Detained hearings are still going forward for people in the U.S., but MPP has been postponed. So basically, people that have hearings in the next, so far in the next month, now just have to wait. Like they're told to show up a month after their scheduled hearing date. There's just kind of a lot of chaos and confusion. People that are homeless, living in these camps, have access to some information through cell phones and things, but there's very few attorneys working on these cases to communicate with their clients there about what's happening. Information sharing just isn't really happening either. So it's really just a pretty terrible situation that's been made even more terrible by the pandemic.
And you just talked about this a little bit, but are there any other changes to immigration protocol that MPP has kind of created at the border?
There's kind of a lot of different things. So it's resulted in a lot of kind of decarceration. So because a lot fewer people are being allowed into the United States to wait for their hearings, it means a lot of the detention centers have actually started to empty out a little bit. So right now, during the last fiscal year, ICE was averaging about 50,000 people detained every day, on the average day. Right now, the number is about 30,000, just under 30,000, I think 27,000 as of maybe a week or two ago. So that's had a little bit of a change. It's meant that, it just kind of had a lot of other effects. So a lot more people that, might not have been detained are being detained now. MPP itself is, has a lot of other issues where, if people are losing their cases, some of them are appealing, but still waiting from, Mexico for their appeal. It's just kind of, it's a very political program to try to keep asylum seekers, people that are going to be harmed in their home country, out of the United States. And it's, without really any concern for what's going to happen to those people. It's really just trying to, deter immigration as much as possible. And obviously with, MPP is, again, kind of on hold, and, isn't taking new cases. So in many ways, it's just kind of a failed experiment that, the government is trying to find ways to get around as well.
John, you mentioned that MPP kind of acts as a deterrent on the border. And so I was wondering if you could describe sort of the danger that migrants face when when they're waiting in Mexico. And there's been stories about kidnappings or other violence happening in these camps. So I was just wondering if you could touch on that. And then also the difficulty in getting counsel, getting lawyers to go into Mexico to represent these people.
Yeah. So, I mean, migrants, whether they're coming out of Central America or, wherever they're coming from, and we see a lot of people coming from all over the world, really, to the southern border to apply for asylum, because that's really the only way to do it. People from East Africa, Southeast Asia, parts of Europe, even, really all over the world are coming up to the U.S.-Mexico border. Many of those people, they don't have a lot of money. They're in a position where they're not able to, they don't have the resources to apply for a visa to come to the United States. So, they're incredibly vulnerable to different types of extortion and, people that are trying to take advantage of people in that situation. So a lot of sexual violence against women and against children. Kidnapping is incredibly common. Extortion from smugglers and traffickers. That's just been, unfortunately, been the reality for for a very long time. Probably realistically the last 2 decades. MPP creates, I think more than anything, creates a situation where people are just spending more time essentially in transit. So if you're, it takes you a month to get to the U.S. border, you're exposed for a month, but if you're an MPP, now you're exposed for the full year, or longer, however long, the case takes. And it also kind of has this additional effect of congregating everyone in the same place. So it makes them, very easy targets. It's very easy for predators to identify people that are in MPP and are going to be homeless. There's an assumption that many of them at least have family that can pay ransoms. It makes people very easy targets. Add to that, homelessness and kind of congregate living situations, and just kind of the instability of housing. So I know in, Matamoros, there's been a lot of sexual violence within the camp, not necessarily perpetrated by people that are there, that are in the camp, but outsiders coming in. And the same thing with different types of extortion. You have a lot of people, a good number of people that aren't Spanish speakers, whether they're from Brazil or Haiti or, any other parts of the world. They're also at, an additional vulnerability because they don't speak the language in that place. They oftentimes don't speak English either, but also don't speak Spanish. So it just creates it creates so many different problems. And then now, at this point, we don't even know what's happening with COVID-19 there. People don't have access to medical testing. They're definitely not, 6 feet apart at all times. And now that there's people being kind of summarily deported, some of those people and other people that are being deported from the U.S., there are a number of cases of people being deported into Mexico with COVID-19 and exposing other people in some of the homeless shelters or migrant shelters. So there was one individual that was deported back to Mexico who tested positive once he returned to Mexico, but infected 14 other people at the shelter that he was staying at. There's been over 100 people deported back to Guatemala with COVID-19, several cases in Haiti, Jamaica, Colombia, and that's just really what we know about. Access to counsel is particularly tough, for, because, basically in the US, if people go into detention, they're detained by ICE, they have access to kind of pro bono lists. They're going into court. They're on dockets where people can kind of monitor who's where, and nonprofits are able to reach out and try to identify people and do screenings to see who qualifies. Nonprofits also have funding to provide representation to people in detention within the United States. People that are in Mexico, it's a very different story. We don't know who most of those people are. The cases are handled out of a variety of different courts. So even in in Brownsville, the immigration judges are appearing by video from all over the country. And we're only seeing dockets if we know, what judge is doing it and really where to look. There really isn't a lot of funding to provide those services, and there just aren't really good screening mechanisms. Some attorneys have gone down just on a strictly volunteer basis. They've kind of eventually gotten some funding to try to provide some resources and some point of contact for people, but it's very, very difficult. It requires the attorneys to go down, to basically volunteer, to take time away from, private practice or their nonprofit, their, paying jobs, to go down there and go into Mexico, to pay their own way down, and, try to feel things out on their own. And it's incredibly, fairly risky for Americans to go into parts of Mexico. There are travel advisors from the State Department that say, don't do this. So, attorneys are risking their safety to be able to provide these services. So it really becomes word of mouth. I've had a couple of MPP clients. They've picked up just kind of word of mouth through other clients or through family members. So it's really kind of ad hoc like that. And then there just aren't the resources to represent all these people. it's like tens of thousands of people, and we're busy enough as it is in the US. So for us to be able to take on, for attorneys to kind of all shoulder that load and take on cases, it's really, really difficult. It means I have to go, we have to go down to Texas to appear at master calendar hearings, like these 10-minute hearings. It means like several trips down. It's just, it's a huge, huge burden for attorneys, and clearly none of these folks are generally able to afford private counsel. So it's, and I think it's purposefully designed that way to cut off access to counsel.
So John, I think maybe you touched on it a little bit there in your last sentence, but hearing all of these human rights issues and issues with access to counsel, what really is the driving purpose behind a policy like this? And do you think whatever the administration's purpose for MPP, whatever that purpose is, do you think that the policy fulfills it?
I think, well, there's kind of different policies, right? Like on the one hand, kind of the public facing policy, the kind of justification for it is to minimize resources on the US side to handle, kind of a surge of cases. I don't think that it's really a surge, but I think it was created really specifically in response to the migrant caravans that were happening. Where people are traveling up in groups together from Central America to kind of have some safety numbers and protect themselves. But then when they got to the US and requested asylum, they're kind of we call them being metered. So Border Patrol would only allow in, 8 people a day to request asylum out of maybe several hundred people. And that kind of started the kind of homeless camps in some of these areas. And MPP, I think, was really created to try to, formalize that policy of preventing people from getting that far. I think, and I think really to protect resources, to to minimize the number of people in detention, which are, oftentimes the detention facilities are kind of pretty horrendous in terms of what's happening there. But I think really the real justification is kind of retaliation against the migrant caravans and against attorneys and other people that were supporting them or helping them, and generally against attorneys for kind of daring to represent non-citizens and people seeking asylum. It's also very much meant to be a deterrent to kind of send a message. If you get here, we're not going to give you relief, even if you're legally entitled to it under U.S. law or under international law. And even if you are entitled to it and we'll get it from the courts, we're still going to make you jump through all these hoops. Like, we are going to make you suffer for it, and really to try to, not just deter people from coming to the U.S., but to deter people from litigating their claims, to keep people from actually, sticking out their claim and fighting to the end, by making people just, hoping that people will just give up, given the conditions. And we see that is happening. That's really a big problem. I'd say probably the majority of cases that have been decided in this program are, removal, kind of quote unquote removal orders. People aren't even here yet to be deported, but what we call in absentia orders, or people didn't show up at their hearing. We don't know what happened to those people. They may have been killed. They may have just decided to go back. They may have gotten status in Mexico, or gotten asylum there, or found work and just decided to kind of, stick with that. But I think a huge number of denials are based solely on failing to appear. Once you kind of get past that, I think we don't really have data, but I think the grant rates are actually pretty good. There are a lot of people that have won their cases, but that usually requires waiting, several months. And, for people that have small children, that's, it's a huge ask for people to live on the streets that long, with children. But, I think it just goes to show how, meritorious a lot of these claims are, that people are willing to stick it through and put up with all this and struggle and suffer and risk so much in this program, because going back home is still going to be worse. But I think, and the government, I think, recognizes that, but still wants to make it as difficult as possible. And that's, I think, part of, it's a much worse version, but something that we're seeing kind of throughout the immigration system as a whole over these past 3 years.
I have a kind of a two-part pre-COVID, post-COVID question. So pre-COVID, were there any exemptions to MPP, ability for people to get past that? And post-COVID, now that there really aren't very many options, and you talked about how there aren't people coming across, what are people's options? Are they just stuck there, or what kind of can they do?
Yeah, so exemptions, I mean, in theory, there were some. In practice, not really. So, and there's kind of two different things to talk about. So the kind of first formal exemption is what's called a non-refoulement issue, or an interview. So basically, it's an interview that people could request either through counsel or on their own, basically saying, it's so dangerous back in Mexico, I shouldn't be forced to wait there. Kind of under ICE policy, there are certain classifications of people that were considered especially vulnerable. So pregnant mother or pregnant women, people with small children, people that had certain medical issues, transgender folks. There's kind of I think those are kind of the main ones. Were supposed to be allowed in. And that very rarely happened. Attorneys down there would, accompany people to the port to keep requesting this, and having to do it for days or weeks, and kind of launch major campaigns to try to get individual people in. And a lot of them were very unsuccessful. I mean, people did get in, but it took a lot of energy and resources and time for each specific person to get in. On the whole, I mean, very, very few of them made it in. Kind of the other, not really an exception so much, but kind of another issue is that the MPP program, under statute and regulations and the kind of nature of the order, it's only supposed to apply to people that present at the port of entry asking for asylum. And that's really, I mean, that's one of two ways that people enter the United States, and the legal classifications for people are very dependent on how they enter. So if they don't present at a port of entry, they're crossing without authorization, or they're crossing between the ports of entry, through the river, climbing a fence, walking through the desert, etc. And people in that situation that are arrested inside the interior, not at a port of entry, are subject to a completely different legal system, basically. They actually have more rights in the immigration courts than people that present at the port of entry, even though it's more disfavored. They're still entitled to apply for asylum there, but they're eligible to bond out of immigration detention, whereas if you present, you're not. Different types, like other things like the burden of proof in immigration proceedings are very different. But again, people that enter without inspection, like by law, aren't supposed to be placed in MPP. And yet that was what was happening. And probably about half to 2/3 of the people that are in MPP are people that enter without inspection and legally shouldn't be there. And ICE has kind of worked its way around that with the help of the immigration courts, where they just don't classify people. on notice to appear, like the charging document, they're supposed to be marked as entering without inspection or as an arriving alien, someone that presented at a port of entry and sought admission. But they wouldn't check that box, and said they would send them back to Mexico. And then when they came back in for their first court date, they were kind of given permission to enter the United States through what's called parole. And based on that parole, then they were classified as an arriving alien, even though it's really classifying someone, kind of after the fact. It's done completely backwards. And they're only in that situation to be classified that way because they're placed in MPP. So it's this very legally weird thing. Most immigration judges were saying, though, well, I don't have the authority to decide this. I mean, it's like strictly within their job description and their authority to decide if someone's properly there, and if the court has jurisdiction, right? But they're refusing to even acknowledge jurisdiction issues. And then the Board of Immigration Appeals just issued, I think earlier this week, a decision saying, yeah, no, this is totally fine, what ICE is doing and the way that they're skirting the law to classify people this way and put them in the program. And it was done in a pro se case, so the person didn't have an attorney arguing for them. That person couldn't be found, so they weren't even able to brief the issue. And it's really kind of a cowardly way of for the BIA to implement policy in a non-adversarial way. So, I mean, when people have been fighting that in some places like San Diego, there has been some success there. Outside the Ninth Circuit, the Fifth Circuit is really the only other place that has these types of cases. All those courts have said, ICE can do whatever, DHS can do whatever it wants, how they classify people this way. So those are really the only exceptions there, and they're, entirely not followed. Marissa, did you have a second question?
Yeah, just that now that kind of COVID has taken over and there's not even an MPP option, what are the options for the people who were stuck there, who had a court date and are not able to do that now?
Mm-hmm. Right now, it's just waiting, and we don't really know how long. Initially, non-attained court was announced that it was going to be postponed, that all those hearings were going to be canceled. Everyone was just kind of waiting and like, okay, well, what are you doing with MPP? And it was really, they're basically making like a decision like the Friday before, Friday evening before the Monday hearings, what's going to happen with those Monday hearings. So it doesn't even really give us a chance to process it and communicate with our clients about what to expect the next business day, basically. And they've been doing it, kind of like a couple weeks at a time. And then like the next time, like the Friday that order expires, then announcing what they're going to do the following business day. So they've gone through a couple iterations of that. I think at this point, the announcements are a little bit more permanent-ish. They're starting to extend things by about a month at a time. I don't know if they can really do it much longer than that, but I think kind of given, for non-detained court, things are a lot more flexible and drawn out anyway. MPP, there just isn't really the luxury of time. So they're just kind of continuing things here and there and being done very informally. And, we're hearing that cases are being continued, several days before the announcement actually goes out. And even then it doesn't get entered in the system. So when people check through like the court's online system or phone system, they're not even seeing that their hearing has been rescheduled. So, even if it's kind of falls within the guidance that's been given, or, the official notices. So it's really just kind of a mess. At this point, it's just sort of waiting indefinitely to see what happens. Like I had a client that's basically been waiting since, mid-March he had his final hearing scheduled in mid-March. And now it just kind of keeps getting pushed back. So, we're not, I don't know, it's hard to even tell them like really what to expect. It may depend on, where things are in a month but again, none of us have any idea where the world is going to be at that point. So they're really just stuck there waiting. Honestly, kind of the only option that the government has given them is to try to cross, illegally, to cross without inspection, to sneak in, and go somewhere in the U.S. where it's going to be safer for them. And once they're inside, some of them can actually get their court changed to a regular immigration court and go that way. Or they can, just kind of live without authorization for some, however long. So it's a really bizarre process, and it's still kind of encouraging, unauthorized immigration, which is kind of the whole point of, what they're trying to deter. So, unfortunately, or I guess kind of honestly, that's sort of the option that's left for people, is to try it that way. In worst cases, that they just get sent back again and, still have their court date. So, yeah, it's not at all a functional system, unfortunately.
John, just changing topic very briefly, I was wondering if you could talk about the COVID situation in detention centers around the country and here in Minnesota, because, COVID has been spreading rapidly in jails and detention centers and prisons. And I know you've done lots of work in habeas and that type of stuff. So I was wondering if you could talk about whether people are being released, if it's spreading in Minnesota, that type of thing. Yeah,
so it's actually probably the thing I know most about and spend the most time on, but it's something that I don't really know that much about at this point. Nationally, there's close to 1,000 cases reported by ICE in immigration detention centers. At I guess at this point over 50 different detention centers around the country. Those numbers are basically self-reported by ICE. They've tested about twice as many people as have been are confirmed to have tested positive. We don't know really what those numbers mean. It looks like about a 60% positive rate on those tests, but there's also like a potentially 5-day lag in the testing numbers. So they're reporting, tests that have been administered, not necessarily tests that have, cleared or, led to results yet. We don't know how they're reporting numbers. Like if someone tests positive, is tested and then is deported and tests positive, if they're disclosing those positive tests, or similarly if they're released from custody during that time. So it's really, really hard to figure out exactly what's happening, and I think that's very intentional. Like I mentioned before, the immigration detention numbers, our population is down pretty considerably from where it was a few months ago. That's not really because ICE is releasing people, it's more simply because they're not arresting new people at the border. They're still transferring people into ICE custody from criminal custody. There are, I think, still some arrests being made in the interior by ICE, carrying out enforcement operations. But again, we don't really know. ICE is very secretive about all of this. At this point, there aren't any confirmed cases in the Minnesota detention centers. Minnesota has a few detention centers that are, ICE contracts with county jails. The biggest are Sherburne, Freeborn, and Candy, Ojai counties. Some additional people at Carver County. At this point, I don't think there's anyone in Nobles County or Polk County, but they are contracted. Generally, they only have a few people at a time. As far as I know, there's been one test done out of I think about 250 to 300 people in ICE detention in Minnesota. Those numbers are also down from about 500 normally. That one test was for someone that had flu-like symptoms. Basically they did a flu test on him, determined that he tested positive for flu, and then didn't bother with the COVID test, and then released him. So we're not actually even sure if there's been a single COVID-19 test done. There's definitely been reports of people with symptoms, but we don't really know. ICE is reporting like direct ICE staff that work at the jails, but that doesn't really apply to anyone here in Minnesota because we're all county jails and not, you know, the jails aren't run by ICE directly. We don't have any numbers about actual jail staff in Minnesota if people have tested positive or been symptomatic or anything like that. People are sometimes being quarantined, but not necessarily. You know, new people are being brought in and released directly into the general population. It's just kind of a mess, and everyone is pretty terrified of what's happening. I think the closest case to Minnesota, we just found out about yesterday, was in Polk County, Iowa, and ICE oftentimes moves people between the facilities in Iowa and Minnesota, kind of depending on space. And we don't really know anything about that case either. We just know that there was a confirmed case there. So it's really kind of, unfortunately, like we just don't know anything about what's happening. Like we're not able to get information in response to requests. You know, we don't know where things are at. You know, we've been, you know, involved in litigation along with the clinics at the U to try to get some people released. There's a couple of petitions in particular out of the law school clinics seeking release on the basis of COVID-19. And those cases are still pending, but the kind of initial report and recommendations from the magistrate judges have basically said, until there's a confirmed case here, we're not going to order anyone released. Kind of on the flip side, the government has also argued if there are positive cases, then people shouldn't be released because they would present a danger to the community. So it's really kind of this brutal catch-22. There's a big pro se petition that was filed out of Sherburne County, one of the pods or one of the units there, with 62 people, called creatively the like Sherburne 62 case. And they had appointed counsel and argued a temporary restraining order in court, and basically kind of the same result. They were told until someone tests positive, the federal court isn't going to release people. Again, based on no tests. So, you know, ICE kind of gets to have it both ways, in a lot of different ways here. Around the country, that's been a little bit different. Other districts, especially where there are detention centers with positive cases, especially with individuals that are, you know, they have tested positive, people are being ordered released. Particularly people that are kind of defined by the CDC as medically vulnerable. They have pulmonary or respiratory conditions, people that are pregnant, because we do detain pregnant women, people with autoimmune disorders, things like that, and elderly folks are getting released in small numbers. But I think over the past 3 weeks, ICE has released, I think, 150 people due to court orders, which is a very small drop in the bucket. ICE has identified about 4,500 detainees nationally that are considered medically vulnerable under CDC guidelines and ICE guidelines, and have voluntarily released very, very few of them. You know, over the past 2 or 3 weeks, basically, ICE's detention numbers have dropped by about 200. So that means ICE has maybe voluntarily released about 50 people out of 30,000. And about, I don't know, about 1 to 2% of the people that they have identified as at high risk here. There is a national injunction that was issued out of the Central District of California in a case called Freihat v. ICE that ordered ICE to conduct a review of everyone in detention to determine if they were medically vulnerable or not within 10 days. That 10-day period expired April 26th. So that's how we found out that the ICE has identified 4,500 medically vulnerable people. The order didn't require them to release anyone, just to identify them and then assess whether or not they should be released or not. And ICE has basically said, okay, here's all these people, we're going to keep detaining all of them. Locally, we've been filing requests with ICE to release medically vulnerable people, especially individuals that are HIV positive and have other like pretty serious health issues. People that have suffered heart attacks or strokes, people with pretty severe respiratory illnesses. 3 weeks for a response on that. ICE has said, yeah, we know he's vulnerable. but hasn't actually responded to the request. So it's it's kind of hard to know exactly what's happening. We're trying to figure out what to do based on virtually no data. We hear little kind of rumors here and there. I won't repeat because they're not confirmed, but we kind of hear rumors about staff or about detainees that are coughing or have high fevers and things like that, and no way to get them tested. It takes days to get copies of medical records. They're oftentimes incomplete and don't show, any of the reports of these symptoms, other things like that. So it's just very, very difficult, and we're still stuck with, very few people are actually getting released. The detain court itself has, definitely seen some changes. I'd say probably, historically prior to this, the detain court here in Minnesota would have maybe about 200 people on their dockets every week with detained hearings. And that's dipping down into, 30, 40 a week or so. We have 5 judges in Minnesota, 2.5 of them basically hear detained cases. And now they moved all 5 to hearing detained cases, kind of wanted, 1 day a week. Each of them has it. Each of them are seeing only maybe 5 to 7 people a day now. Some people are getting moved from Minnesota down to the south. We know that there's some people who moved down to LaSalle in Louisiana, which has been kind of one of the hot spots. And they were tested down there and then deported before they got their results. So it's just really hard to know, exactly what's happening and kind of figuring out what to do about it. We're kind of doing this all alone and aren't getting a lot of help from the courts, unfortunately, or from the legislature or anywhere else to try to get people out. But, everyone kind of knows that this is going to blow up. And the scope of the problem is we know much, much worse than, the numbers actually show at this point.
Well, thanks, John, for, bringing insight to a lot of these issues and what the situation looks like here in Minnesota and nationally. I think we can all say that, some of the things you've talked about are really troubling, and obviously the situation sounds like, it's kind of been something that's just evolving so much that it's hard to even keep track of what to think about it. So yeah, we have enjoyed talking to you and appreciate the time you've taken with us. And like I said, the insight that you brought to this issue, I'm sure a lot of people will take a lot away from it.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, and I don't want to take up any more of your time. I just wanted to note too, obviously this is an issue that affects a lot of non-citizens, and, in our community, and, MPP is a little more remote for most people here, but, I think most people, live their lives without thinking about the couple hundred people in immigration detention here in Minnesota. But I think really kind of the broader importance of this is that, many of these detention centers, like Candy, Ojai, Freeborn, Nobles County, which doesn't really have a lot of people right now, many of them are actually meatpacking plants, right? And we've seen really one of the hot spots in the Midwest for these outbreaks, especially outside of the major cities. And I think it kind of goes without saying, these jails are pretty big employers, right? Or they're within, county government buildings where people where the guards interact with other people that work there. And then they go home at night. Some of them, I'm sure, live with people that work in the meatpacking plants, or at least have contact with them. And I think that there's really a risk for cross exposure here. So people that are getting it from, spreading it from the detention to the packing plants and vice versa. Regardless, all those, all the jail staff go home at night, right? None of them they're not locked up. They go home at night in their communities, whether in Elk River or in Minneapolis or somewhere else. And it's really potentially a hotspot for spreading COVID-19 kind of throughout. So what happens in immigration detention here doesn't stay in immigration detention. It's really a community and public health issue that really hasn't been addressed adequately. That really risks causing harm or putting all of us at risk. I think it's really important to recognize that, as we find out more about the disease and as we kind of slowly find out about what's happening in immigration detention right now.
Yeah, that's a really good point as well. Just to understand, obviously COVID-19, the way it works is that it spreads through the community. So understanding those touch points and that impact is another really great point.
All right. Do we have any
If you
more?
all have other questions, I have a few more minutes, or else I'll let you go back to enjoying your vacation.
Marissa, do you have any more questions?
I don't have any more. Thanks, John, so much for talking with us. It was really helpful and really nice to see the contrast between some of the stuff happening at the border and then some of the stuff happening here in Minnesota. I think that was really helpful.
Thank you so much for talking with us.
Oh yeah, it's my pleasure, and hope to see all of you doing immigration work in the future.
Awesome.
Yeah, awesome.
All right. Well, okay. Hopefully we'll put this online.
Yeah.
Yes, this will
I
be
think they
online.
can cut it there. I don't know if we're supposed to give it an appropriate close or something.
Yeah, I'm just gonna stop it.